Hey everybody, it's great to have you with me. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the challenges of traditional project management. Now, you might already be wondering, why do we need to learn about something like this? Well, if you're going on to learn about things like DevOps, Agile, CI/CD, and other types of modern tools, processes, and frameworks that we can use to help with software development, then it really does help to understand how we used to do things, and most importantly, what were some of the challenges that we used to face that these modern things actually help us to address. So within this lesson, we'll cover off the waterfall model, which is a project management methodology used in software development in the past, and we'll also walk through a scenario to help understand what sort of issues we actually used to face when we use the traditional types of project management that we've now come to replace with things like Agile. So let's go ahead and jump in. Now, when I'm talking about traditional project management, I'm talking about back in the 70s and 80s when we actually first started to develop really complex applications for use across government, defense, and even large enterprise. And at this time, developers were asking the question, how can we build these complex apps? How can we do so in a way that is going to make them reliable and meet the needs of the customer? And back then they thought, hey, we've got a really great idea. If we want to look at how to build things, why don't we take some inspiration from how people actually build buildings? Okay, so when we're looking at how to build an app, why don't we see if we can take any lessons learned from the people who go and actually construct buildings? So what did that process look like? Well, at a really high level, we were saying we've got a building, maybe a project manager comes along, gathers a whole heap of information about what sort of building we require, how many rooms, what's the height, what's the power needs, and so on. Once the project manager had that information, it would be passed on to the designer, who would go and create a design of the actual building itself. Once that design was finalized, of course, the builders could go ahead and actually construct the building itself. Now, once that building had been fully constructed, we'd hopefully do some sort of tests and checks to make sure it was all ready to go and it had been signed off before we go ahead and actually open up the building for public use. So that was the high-level process of what building a building actually looked like. And in technology, back in the 70s and 80s, we thought that that would be a really great approach for handling the development of software, and in fact, not even just development within IT, but other sorts of disciplines like infrastructure, which also followed the same sort of approach. Now in technology, what we did is we created a project management methodology that looked just like that building process. We started off by gathering the requirements, we then designed our solution, finally we went on to build it, and then once we've built it, we could test it, deploy it, and open it up for use and just go on to continually maintain it. Now we call this the waterfall model because just like the building and construction process that we copied, what we would say is that you have to start with one step and then you can't move on to the next step until that is complete. So you would not start design until you had all of the requirements. You would not start implementation until you'd finished off the design, and so on. Now that might have worked within the construction industry where things aren't really going to change. You're going to have a plot of land, you're going to have some building that needs to be a certain height and it's going to have so many rooms for so many people. But we know in technology that things do change quite rapidly. So this waterfall model had a range of different issues, and we'll come to learn these throughout this course. Now, some of the other similarities that you also might start to notice is that, like the construction industry, in technology, we actually have a lot of different roles that match similar names to what you see in construction as well. So if this is the waterfall model that we started to use back in the 70s and 80s, and in fact it went on to be used for many different years, what did it actually look like when we were building software? What sort of challenges did we actually face? Well, let's have a look by walking through a scenario. Let's say that you work for Ausimart, a fictitious company that works across the globe selling a range of different Australian paraphernalia, toys, and other sorts of things. Now let's say you're using the waterfall model to develop this solution. Maybe you've already got the solution online. It might just have some really basic information on what different products that you provide that you can sell to end users. But let's say that your VP of marketing comes along and says, hey, you know what, we really need to make this a store. We can't just list information, we need to sell all of these products through the store. Let's make it an e-commerce application. So you now need to go ahead and add shopping cart functionality. Now, as the lead developer in control of that, you might go ahead and say, okay, no problem. Thanks, VP. That's exactly what we're going to do. I'm going to go away now and I'm going to plan everything. I'm going to follow the waterfall model by upfront going ahead and gathering all sorts of information, maybe run some workshops from the different members of the marketing team and other important stakeholders, understand exactly what this shopping cart functionality needs to do. Now, really importantly, when technology teams followed the waterfall model, this initial requirements gathering and scoping phase was seen as a very significant task. It was really important to make sure that you understood exactly what you had to deliver for this project. So right at the start of what could be a really massive and long project, you had to try and understand the customer needs and lock them down. And sadly, this could often end in frustration for the customer with a range of different arguments around, well, I thought this would be in scope. No, it's not in scope. I'm sorry. All sorts of communications issues and maybe even legal teams getting involved around what this scope was. So it could become a very important, significant exercise that sometimes resulted in a range of frustration. And you can understand it is important to scope it out because the development team would need to understand what it is they are delivering, how long it's going to take, how many resources they need to deliver it, and therefore what that project is actually going to cost. Now again, because this was a really important phase of the project that was being performed all up front, it often meant that the project scope, the contract that you would go back to the customer and confirm whether it was correct or not, was very, very technical in nature. So the development team might go back to the VP of marketing and say, hey, I've finalized this project scope, I've completed my requirements analysis, and I think this is what you want for your shopping cart. Now, the VP of marketing probably isn't a technical person and maybe actually has their own busy schedule. So they might give it a review. Maybe it's a quick review. Maybe it's a long review. Maybe they understand most of it. Maybe they don't understand some of it. Okay, so the problems that we would see here is that it could be approved really quickly and unfortunately not actually meet the requirements of the customer, or it might be approved really slowly and take a lot of back and forth about what is and is not going to be included within the project scope. And this is all before you've even started building the solution and knowing what other sorts of problems you might encounter. And the customer hasn't even seen any of the solution yet either. So they don't really know what it is you are delivering them other than the words you've put in a document. But either way, let's say that you've gone ahead, you've got that project scope approved and signed off. Now it means you need to go to the next phase. You need to actually design the solution. Okay, so when we look at the waterfall model, we've gone through, we've completed the requirements analysis, we've performed the design. Hopefully that's all been signed off, and hopefully that actually is going to meet the customer needs. But again, we're not going to know that for some time, because what do we do now? We go ahead and we build the solution. When we're following the waterfall model, you've got all of that signed off. You're going to start the development of your solution. Maybe it's in January. Everyone's excited, ready to go. You're building that shopping cart functionality that has been requested. Time is going to keep flicking on by. The months will fly. And before you know it, it's time to actually go and deploy your solution for the customers. Now, what does that deployment day look like? Well, hopefully it's very delightful. Hopefully what you do is you finish off the shopping cart functionality, you move it into production, you've met all of the requirements that your customers had, you've delivered this solution on time, on budget, and most importantly, let's hope that the customers are happy themselves. Everyone takes a sigh of relief. Now, what do we say if this is exactly what happens? We say that's magic. We say it's magic because, sadly, that isn't often the case when you are following the waterfall model. Many times you actually had project time, budget blowouts, users that were unhappy, and arguments around the requirements. So what it could, in fact, look like is something like this. Whilst you're going through and developing the solution halfway through the project, the VP of marketing might come back and say, hey, we actually need ratings. Is that included? We want ratings functionality as part of our shopping cart. You say, no, that's not in the scope. We didn't list that anywhere. But maybe the customer wins. The VP says, I'm putting my foot down. You have to deliver this. And it causes some issues with the project schedule. It wasn't part of the design. No one's included any of this information up front. You haven't had any workshops with users. So you don't really understand what you're building, but you have to work on that anyway. When it comes time to actually deliver that solution in the end, maybe your users are going to say something like, hey, I thought there was going to be some search engine optimization, or this isn't what I expected, or why isn't this solution working on mobile? Mobile's really important to us right now. This is perhaps somewhat of a more common scenario of when people were following the waterfall model. Angry users, angry VPs, development teams that were really trying their best and thought that they had included everything up front in the design, but there was just no way for them to know exactly what was needed, and there was no way to really be certain that the customer knew exactly what they were getting because they didn't see any of that product for months. They couldn't provide any feedback. They couldn't give you any information on whether it was or was not correct, other than some initial requirements and design documents that had to be signed off and approved by the higher-ups that may or may not have understood what you were actually documenting. So when we use the traditional project methodologies like waterfall, we often had angry customers, requirements and designs that were simply just wrong because, how much can you actually get right when you design all of that up front when no one has seen the actual product? There's not many opportunity with the waterfall model for customers to actually get involved and provide feedback. When you think about it, you start that design at the front, you spend all of that time building the product, and it's not until delivery that the customers actually see the product. And really, even if you did manage to get all of those requirements correct and meeting the customer needs at the start, well, the reality is that things can change. So even if you had that project nailed down and matching customer expectation at the time, the customer's expectations might change throughout the duration of the project itself. So often when we followed waterfall model, we had unhappy customers, over budget solutions, over time products, and really everyone was just unhappy. So folks, these are the types of challenges that we faced when we were working with traditional project management methodologies when we were developing software solutions. We're going to continue to build on this knowledge as we move throughout this course and understand some of the ways that we can overcome these challenges with newer frameworks, processes, and tools. Thanks for joining me. I'll catch you in the next video.